For the average F2P player, 4 stars are going to be the majority of your roster. And while yes, they might not be flashy or hyped up compared to the 5 stars, you shouldn't underestimate them. A lot of them can really hold their own in MOC. And some can easily go toe-to-toe with the best of them when you have their 6th Eidolon. Getting E6 units is usually a breeze compared to stacking 4 limited 5 stars on a team. Today we'll be rating each 4-star character at their base form and then taking a look at their most impactful Eidolon. Let's start with Asta. Asta's a fire harmony unit and she provides quite a lot for your team. She can give your whole team attack percent and speed buffs, and she also has a great amount of toughness breaking with her skill. She's all around a solid harmony unit, and there's lots of MOC gimmicks that she can get around, especially with the 9-stack Gauge Girl. The thing with Asta though is that her attack percent buff depends on whether your enemy has fire weakness or not, and her speed boost at E0 usually has a downtime of 1 or 2 turns. A tier, which is why her E4 is S tier. Her Eidolons give her quite a bit more energy and she gives you so much stats with little to no downtime. Even if you have 5-star harmonies, if you've got an E4 Asta, you can still consider swapping her in if your enemy has fire weakness. Now onto Arlan, D tier. I intentionally put him second instead of first in alphabetical order because he's genuinely the worst of the worst. His skill eats his max HP instead of skill points, but it's still a single target ability despite being a destruction character. His talent gives him more damage percent when his health gets low, which is his main selling point. It's a huge damage boost, but at the same time you've gotta keep him in check so that he doesn't die. I have no doubt that people can make him work and that he can clear MOC with enough investment, but Arlan's balancing act causes you more trouble than it's worth at E0. Admittedly, his E2 and E4 are pretty mid. His E2 cleanses him whenever he uses skill or ult, and it can only be useful against stat debuffs since he can't even act when he's CC'd. He also resists dots through his A4 trace. He also already resists dots through his A4 trace. But his E6 is extremely great though, as it boosts his damage by quite a lot. His E6 is extremely great though, as it boosts his damage quite a lot, if I may say, by tenfold. With all of this said, he's a low A tier. The problem with Arlan is that the majority of people don't run him properly, when all he needs is to be run with a shielder and a bunch of SP negative support units to giga boost his stats. Don't underestimate an E6 Arlan ult. Done Heng. You get him at the start of the game and he's a solid win DPS character, and he'll cover that element for quite a while for most accounts. His numbers are solid, but he needs some skill and timing to use effectively. His true strength is that he can unload a huge burst of damage with his talent that gives him Wind Rest Pen, and his ultimate that's got a huge damage multiplier against slowed enemies. But the problem with hot characters is that they can't deal with waves and summons well. B tier. At E5 though, his damage boosts quite significantly by reducing his talent's cooldown, and whenever he kills an enemy with his ultimate, he gains another turn. I'd say this shoots him up to A tier. Herta. Now, Herta comes with the problem of being an erudition unit, where the MOC format has a wave, an elite and some mobs, then 2 elites. This means that AoE units aren't always going to get their full value because there's rarely more than 3 units in MOC. But in the times that there's lots and lots of waves, that's where Herta truly shines. At E0, I'll put her at D tier. At E6, she gains lots of attack percent, damage percent, and crit percent buffs, and she can really hammer in her enemies. She's still content dependent and falls short sometimes, but with enough investment, she can clear MOC 0 cycle. For units like her, I'll put a specialist tier, just to display that despite being D tier, there's way more nuance to them than just that. Hook is one of the few fire DPS characters, although she may be getting some competition soon. Her main thing is that her talent gives her extra motion values, or MVs, and deals extra damage to enemies that are burned, and her skill burns targets to set her talent up. Her ultimate enhances her next skill to become Blast AoE, which can allow for quite a hefty amount of damage since all the extra MVs and damage percent are applied for each enemy. She can be a decent main DPS and sub DPS, but the fact that her normal skill and ultimate are single target, it's a little off-putting, and this means that she'll also take a couple turns to clear waves. I'd say she's a high C tier. Hook at E6 gives her quite the improvement since her burn now spreads whenever she hits an enemy that's already burned. And it also skyrockets her damage to burned enemies by 20% and her enhanced skill by the same amount. Some people might disagree with me, but currently, Hook E6 is A tier and will be the strongest for quite a while. Lukadeez, B tier. Luka's a great physical sub-DPS that has a hefty 20% damage amp with his ultimate. His 24% max HP bleed on his skill is also no joke, and it can tear through elites with ease. This talent can re-proc bleeds when you use a basic attack when the talent is up. Luka's E6 increases damage percent and attack percent enough to warrant him becoming a main DPS, although you'll still want to basic every now and then to proc his talent. At this point, Luka becomes more of a hunt character and suffers the same issues. Still though, I'd say he's A tier. March 7th, she's a solid preservation unit, and though she may need a secondary sustainer in most teams, I'd say her ultimate that has an AoE freeze is well worth it. Against gimmicky elites, she can cut in the middle of their action and disrupt their pesky abilities. Due to her having a counter every time someone shielded is hit, you'll be surprised at how fast March can break enemies and get her ult back up at the same time. She's a high B tier. Her Eidolons make her shields last a little longer and increase her damage encounters. Maybe you could consider her a low S tier at that point, but she's still an A tier for me. Natasha, the baseline healer, gets a baseline grade, B tier. She can spot cleanse debuffs and is a must build for new accounts, though she'll lag behind most other sustain units. Her E5 increases her healing frequency and capabilities quite a bit, but she'll always be locked behind SP economy and single target cleansing. This'll put her at A tier. Lynx, she's pretty much Nat 2.0, and she's marginally better than Natasha. She does provide a little more utility by increasing a unit's max HP and aggro with their skill, and her ultimate has an AoE cleanse attached to it. Her Eidolons increase her healing capabilities as well, but don't add too much utility to shoot her up a tier. Speaking of a tier, she's A tier. Pela, instant S tier. Pela's 40% AoE Death Shred on her ultimate is just way too valuable, and the fact that she can use her ultimate every 2 to 3 turns is just insane for an E0 unit to be able to do. She can also dispel buffs with her skill, and she's also SP positive. Pela's an extremely simple and efficient character. Her Eidolons boost her own damage, but her Ice Rest Shred is quite nice if you have an Ice DPS on your team. If anything, I wish I could have 2 copies of Pela instead of getting Eidolons for her. Jingliu, at E0, her main DPS capabilities are decent, and she can also serve as a decent sub DPS if you don't want to commit to gambling for your damage. When she has 4 tiles of the same suit, she gives herself huge amounts of attack percent, and her skill increases her damage percent for her next basic attack. She might require some getting used to, but she's quite fun to play and is a solid B tier. When you hit her E4 though is when things get real spicy. Her damage theoretically increases by 24%, but in reality you have a 24% of doubling your enhanced basic attacks every time you use her skill points. And of course, her E5 makes her basic deal all the more damage. Oh, and since her basic attacks are blast AoE, and they're her main source of damage, she doesn't suffer the same problems that most erudition units do, and all she really needs is a lot of SP to burn through. S tier. Sampo Koski. For the sake of clarity, I'll put Sampo at D tier to ward off any newbies from building him, but let me tell you that he's a damage over time specialist through and through. His ultimate boosts dots, and though his damage is subpar, if you match him up with other dot units, he can perform quite nicely alongside them. The thing with dot comps though is that it's hard to find a stage where they're all weak to all of your dot applier's elements. But that barely matters if you got someone like Kafka on your team. But on his own, he's pretty meh. Speaking of meh, Serval at E0 is pretty mid as well. Her damage comes from her shock and her breaks. I don't deny that she can deal with waves well, but when it comes to elites, her damage usually doesn't cut it, and she takes way too long to set up her shocks, since a lot of her value comes from being able to have 2 shocks active at the same time, and being able to extend them. She's not a good main DPS, but she's a decent breaker sub DPS. C tier. Serval at E6 ramps her damage quite a lot, and her ultimate applying shock to all enemies is quite nice. She bumps up to a high B tier. Sushang. Sushang's a physical hunt character, and her stats are decent. She deals increased MVs or skill multipliers against weakness broken enemies with her sword stance triggers, and she gives herself attack percent and an extra turn whenever she uses her ultimate. She increases the damage percent of her sword stance every time it's used. She synergizes well with other breakers, and oddly enough, her sword stance stance is affected by effect hit rate against unbroken enemies. B tier. Her eidolons are mainly for quality of life, as it helps her SP generation, makes her a little tankier, and increases her break effect and speed. These give her a small increase in damage, but this does shoot her up to a low A tier. Tingyun. Tingyun is the premier support for any hyper carry. I know that everyone already says that Tingyun is the best support in the game, and for good reason. This is because she gives everything a hyper carry could want: attack percent, damage percent, and energy. All she's missing is being able to give crit rate or crit damage. What's great is that the buffs she gives are quite balanced, so that the diminishing return from stacking stat buffs isn't at all noticeable. And to top it all off, she's SP positive, A tier. And if you're wondering why she's A tier and not S tier alongside Pela at E0, is because Tingyun's buffs are still subject to diminishing returns if you have more harmonies, or if your main DPS has built-in buffs. While Pela, on the other hand, doesn't have to worry about any of that. They're both good, but there's still a little gap there. At E6, she boosts speed on ultimate, which is another stat that almost every carry wants. It also increases her buffs by quite a significant amount, and the energy that she gives. This shoots her to an S tier, and I don't see anyone being able to outperform her anytime soon. Yukong. She's a little hard to use and slot into teams due to her being SP neutral or negative, but in teams that she is usable in, she's great. Yukong has a fat attack percent buff on her skill, but they're only applied for the next 2 allies that act. Because of this, Yukong performs well in teams with 2 DPSs that can go SP neutral or positive. She also provides quite a huge crit boost on her ultimate if her skill is active. At E0, I'd say she's solid and she lands at B tier, but I'll put her at C tier to ward off beginners building her without thinking about it, since people are going to click at the end of this video and take the tier list at face value without listening to the nuance. But if you are listening to the nuance, thanks for making it this far. At E6, she increases her energy regeneration and makes it so that you don't have to time her ultimate with her skill anymore. Yukong is a low S tier for me, and I really think that she's underutilized in some comps. But once more SP neutral DPSs comes out, I think she's really going to shine. Guinaifen is the new 4-star in 1.4, and she's a fire nihility unit that burns her enemies, and her talent causes burned enemies to take increased damage. She also reprocs burns with her ultimate, and she has great synergy with Hook and other units that rely on DOTs. Her skill is Blast AoE and applies burn on all enemies hit, so it's quite easy to set her up. She's a great SP positive sub DPS that offers dots and vulnerability. A tier. Her eidolons increase her burn's damage multipliers, reduce enemy effect rest on her skill, and generate more energy for her. I think she might be deserving of a low S tier rating due to her synergies with dots and hook comps. That's all the current 4 stars. Keep in mind that this tier list is with MOC and only 4 stars in mind. I think only some DPSs go down a tier if I included 5 stars. I also would normally put A instead of S and F instead of D. But since this is the ranking that the gacha community is used to, I'll just heed and adjust for the general public. Thank you for watching, and if you like this type of slop content, please consider subscribing. See ya!